At the bank of a small river in the north of Italy, a full Roman legion stood arrayed in fine order. They had come to a halt here, at the symbolic boundary of Italian land, after a victorious march southward from Gaul, new territory freshly conquered in the year 49 BCE. For almost a decade, these soldiers had followed their commander on this hard-fought, brutal, but well-executed campaign, and by now each man would willingly follow him to their death. But here the 13th Legion had arrived at a crossroads. The roughly 6,000 troops knew that one of two fates awaited them on the other side of the little river. But which fate was theirs, they didn't yet know. All eyes rested on the solitary figure of their trusted commander, who stood apart from them at the bank of the Rubicon River, his red military cloak trailing in the wind at his back, his eyes trained on the far horizon. Gaius Julius Caesar remained deep in thought as the water flowed by. To lay down arms would be to enter his homeland in lawful accordance with the Roman Senate's decree, but give in to the designs of his enemies, who tried to disgrace and ruin him. But to forge across this boundary with an armed force would be an act of war against his own country. He would be labeled a traitor and public enemy by the Roman state. But for all that, he would preserve his dignity and his own unstoppable hunger for glory. This momentous decision, one that would shake his world and echo through millennia, awaited him here and now, at the Rubicon's grassy brink. The path to this January day in the year 49 had been long and tortuous, having seen its share of success, tragedy, and betrayal. Caesar's meteoric rise had begun 11 years before, in an alliance with the man who was now his archenemy, the celebrated war hero and statesman Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Setting his sights on the pinnacle of power in Rome, Caesar had made a secret pact with Pompey, along with a third partner, the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Their private oath among each other was called the triumvirate, the rule of 3 men. And with the combined force of Caesar's political skills and vision of reform, Pompey's unshakable reputation, and Crassus's limitless supply of money, their grip on legislation and elections in the Republic went unopposed for years. Working in concert with one another, but each man also ambitious in his own right and pursuing his own aims, the triumvirate shaped a decade, and opponents found themselves falling aside as Caesar's star continued to rise. In an even firmer show of friendship, Pompey had even married Caesar's young daughter, Julia, marking a union that went beyond the political and made them kin. Caesar was elected consul, the head of the Roman Republic, who served a year term of office, and in accord with the Roman custom, after his year was over, he became a proconsul, a provincial governor to administer a territory under Roman dominion. His chosen province was Gaul, the vast area of Western and Central Europe across the Alps from Italy, which had long been poised on the tense frontier of Rome's empire. Caesar saw an opportunity to win military glory by extending their power over this huge territory, by forging alliances and militantly bringing to heel the nations that resisted. The Gauls had long been a foe of the Romans, ever since they had invaded and sacked the capital some 3.5 centuries before, and now Caesar's legions would bring both vengeance upon Gaul and new security for Italy. With the help of Pompey, he received from the Roman Senate extraordinary grants of military command, wielding as many as 11 legions at one time, and completing a campaign that would endure for some 9 years, and take him beyond Gaul to Germany and even the far shores of Britain. During this time, hundreds of thousands, even millions, were sacrificed to Caesar's dreams of glory, Romans and Gauls alike. The cruel fates of the countless enslaved and slaughtered tribes of Gaul mattered little to Caesar, who, like so many other great conquerors, readily climbed to power on a ladder of human lives. This was, after all, the same man who years before, when he was a 32-year-old treasurer with little renown to his name, had been found weeping before a marble portrait of Alexander the Great. When asked why he wept, he answered that Alexander had conquered the known world by his 32nd year, while he, Caesar, had done nothing to leave a lasting memory. No price was too high to pay for the undying glory he hungered for, neither Gallic blood nor the blood of his own fellow Romans. But Caesar wasn't the only one with boundless, ruthless ambitions. Pompey and Crassus had plans of their own, which unfolded while Caesar was away on the northern frontiers. Pompey had been made governor of Spain for a term, and Crassus had been given the province of Syria. Crassus had already won some military fame of his own for defeating the rebel gladiator Spartacus in his younger years, but now he craved more. And to this end, he led an expedition into the Middle East, where he stirred up a war with the Parthians, the powerful nation that succeeded the former Persian Empire. In the year 53, Crassus met his end in a bloody massacre at Parthian hands near the town of Carrhae. His severed head was sent to the Parthian king Orodes, who, some say, ordered molten gold to be poured into its mouth, an ironic end for a man who built his life on unrivaled riches. Pompey, on the other hand, left Spain behind and remained in Rome, where he sought to win the favor of the Roman people, building a new stone theater in the city, the first of its kind, and staging lavish spectacles with gladiators and exotic beasts from the corners of the world. But all the while, Pompey was pursuing his own designs to be the first man in Rome, and, in Caesar's absence, he fell in more and more with Caesar's enemies, who stirred up his envy and ambition against the now famous conqueror of Gaul. The last thread tying the two rivals together snapped when Julia, Pompey's wife and Caesar's daughter, had died before her time. The triumvirate had crumbled with the death of Crassus, and with Julia's death, so went the last traces of their old kinship. During these years, Pompey's influence in the Senate increased until he was virtually the sole leader of Rome, and then it came time, in January of the year 49, for Caesar's legal right to command his armies to expire, for him to demobilize his legions and return to Rome as a civilian, his mission for the empire finished. This was the time when Caesar's enemies, with Pompey at their side, made ready to strike. Caesar had gained a mighty reputation, and his opponents made plans to attack him upon his return, with the force of law or the force of arms, if need be. Pompey had an army of his own at his disposal, near at hand to Rome, and Caesar knew this well. A messenger was dispatched from the Senate to Caesar, relaying this order to give up his army. "Why should I send away my army, when Pompey still keeps his?" he replied. And later he sent word again to Rome, "If Pompey will give up his command, I shall do the same." But Pompey refused, and the dispute, with tensions ramping ever higher, went on until at last the Senate decreed that unless Caesar laid down his arms, they would declare him an enemy of the Roman people. This ultimatum, made by a hostile Senate, with no concessions of their own, was little less than a declaration of war. Caesar was then at Ravenna, a seaside city on the southern border of his province. Just below this city flowed the little stream called the Rubicon, the limit of his province, and his legal command over tens of thousands of the willing soldiers at his back. To cross the Rubicon with his army intact meant open defiance of the Senate, the charge of treason, and a guarantee of violent civil war. And so the moment had come when Gaius Julius Caesar had to make the grim decision to cross treasonously or disarm in defeat. He hesitated on the bank for a long time, silent, in deep thought. His officers and the soldiers in the ranks watched him anxiously, knowing their fates rested with Caesar's. And then finally, as they all held their breath, they saw Caesar stir, his slumping shoulders straightened up robustly, and his face set confidently forward. He turned back to them, solemn, yet fired by a new resolve. He briskly stepped forward and addressed them all with a raised right hand. "Romans, the die is cast. Let us go where the gods and our enemies' injustice guide us. We may yet turn back, but once we cross this river, only the sword will decide how it ends." He sent word that the rest of his army further in Gaul should join his southward march, and swell their ranks as they pressed toward what was now an enemy capital. And here, at the head of his legion, he energetically mounted his horse and drove forward, splashing through the Rubicon, some 6,000 armed men following in his path. And so the die was cast, and the outcome of this civil war would only be decided after 4 grueling years. Carnage across battlefields in Greece, Africa, and Spain, and the death throes of the old republic, after which the Roman world would never be the same. One age ended at the Rubicon, and another began, the age of Caesar. Salvete, folks. Hope you're all doing well. Alea jacta est, the die is cast. We have here the first of what I'm sure will be lots and lots of stories about the very active life and career of Gaius Julius Caesar, one of the real celebrities of Roman history. At the time of recording this, there is a second video on the story of young Caesar and the pirates, when he was kidnapped by pirates, sort of like on his way to a study abroad program, where he was going to learn public speaking over on Rhodes. But here we have our first one, where Caesar is embarking upon the series of Roman civil wars. He's at the tipping point that are going to steer him into years of warfare against his rival Roman politicians and generals, and eventually this process will all see him take his office as dictator, gain lots and lots of more powers, and then fall to the assassin's dagger. We all know how the story ends in the Ides of March 44 BC. So there are a lot of different sources for the story of Caesar crossing the Rubicon and the civil war that ensued after that. And this story here on the channel is sort of patched together from a number of those. One of the most interesting sources I want to talk about here is Caesar's own version, in his own words, of the story, in his commentaries on the Civil War, his Commentarii de Bello Civili, as it's usually titled in Latin, or just Commentaries on the Civil War, or The Civil War. You can find copies of this in a lot of places. This is one of the less talked about aspects of Julius Caesar's character, aside from, of course, as being a political mastermind and formidable general, is that he was also a very cultured, very educated person, and did a lot of writing in his time. He's one of the great Roman authors, and you can still find his books in stores today. If any of you out there have studied Latin, You might have read some of Caesar in your course of study. He's known for having a very straightforward and readable Latin prose style that makes his stuff pretty good for, say, an intermediate-level Latin reader. He was also known to be a really good public speaker as well. The aforementioned study abroad trip when he got kidnapped by pirates turned out pretty well for him. And he even wrote books on topics involving language and grammar, if you would believe it. So one of his famous books, that's no longer surviving today, unfortunately, was called De Analogia, about these topics. It's a book about grammar and language. So he was really kind of a Renaissance man in a lot of ways. Caesar wrote 2 sets of commentaries during his military campaigns, and these are by far his most famous literary works. These are the ones that survive more or less intact down to the modern day. First is the commentary on the Gallic Wars that he wrote during that time when he was up in Gaul, conquering that soon-to-be Roman province in the 50s BC, just before he came down and crossed the Rubicon. And then he adopted a similar method for recounting his own take on events in the earlier years of the Civil War against Pompey. And this was his second major commentary. Now, the reason why Caesar wrote down his commentaries, his personal experiences, both on the Gallic Wars and then also on the Civil Wars, was largely as a way of getting his message out, getting his side of the story told and remembered among his intended audience of Romans. This is a period of time, before Twitter and Facebook and cable news, so Caesar, being away from Rome, needed to make sure that his version of events, as he wanted them to be known by the Roman people. These commentaries, these dispatches that he would send back, are a way that he would control that narrative. That's why he wrote these commentaries. They were originally dispatches from the front that he would send back to Rome from Gaul or out on the field during the Civil War. That would report what happened. And after that, these reports were collected in what's now known as his commentaries. And in fact, the military commentary, the commentarios, was a literary genre during this time as well. Commanders would, sort of write their military memoirs. A famous general before Caesar, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, wrote commentaries as well. So Caesar is also acting within a kind of literary convention here. So anyway, this is one of the more interesting things about his commentaries on the Civil War, specifically where this story comes from. You can read between the lines of how Caesar describes the events, and you start to notice one of the real rhetorical goals in his writing of these events that he's involved in, which is to subtly justify his actions in those early years of the Civil War. It gets a lot more interesting in the way he describes his enemies, for instance, as people who were simply unreasonable in dealing with him. And the Civil War happened, in his view, as he expresses here, because Caesar needed to protect his dignity as a Roman man. Poor Caesar, was just there trying to get his proper respect, and he had every legal right to do what he did, but his enemies would simply not have it. And they forced his hand into initiating the Civil War. They wanted it. They're the ones who really pushed it. So what you're getting in his commentaries is not just the description, but really Caesar's spin on the situation. It's the Civil War as Caesar would want it to be told. And of course, one of the famous features of Caesar's commentary when you read them is that he writes entirely in the third person. So he doesn't say, I did this, I did that. He says, Caesar did this, Caesar did that, which gives it this air of impartiality, that this is an objective sort of news report of what's happening. And if you sort of let yourself be lulled into his story that he's telling, you kind of forget that it's Caesar writing this, who's trying to persuade you the entire time. Another interesting account of the story of Caesar crossing the Rubicon that partly inspired this as well comes from the Roman epic poet Lucan, Marcus Annius Lucanus, who wrote a text called The Civil War, or sometimes called Pharsalia, after the Battle of Pharsalus against Pompey in 48 BC. So this is a much more sort of, fantastical, epic version of the story that Lucan recalls. Lucan is writing in the 60s AD, under the Emperor Nero. So this is, 100 years plus after Caesar's original crossing of the Rubicon. And this is the poem where if you watch another video on the Wine Dark Sea channel, the Oracles of the Dead video, that's also drawn from this same text, from Lucan's Civil War. It's an epic poem about the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. And Lucan really has this kind of Gothic taste for how he describes events. It's almost like a kind of, like a horror movie version in some ways of the Civil War. Really fascinating stuff. And when he describes Caesar crossing the Rubicon, it becomes this kind of mythical, fantastical event, where Caesar encounters a phantom of personified Rome that rises up before him on the waters. And this phantom of Rome, she asks him where he's going, and he finally makes the call to forge ahead across the river, and the whole world is thrown into chaos. Lucan's account is one of the early instances, I think, we can see the mythologization of crossing the Rubicon as this world-shattering event. And now, of course, I think this mythologization has really caught on over the millennia. Crossing the Rubicon is now something that we say. It's a phrase that is synonymous with passing a point of no return. Now, to turn from the literary detail to the geographical detail, I suppose, the river Rubicon has this important value as the boundary of Italy in this period. It's a symbolic point, as the boundary of Italian land, where a Roman commander who was coming back from campaign was expected to demobilize his troops before crossing into home territory, sort of returning home as a civilian. Outside of Italian land, outside of the heartland, was where you did military activity. When you returned, you were expected to return as a civilian when you crossed that sacred boundary. It's worth mentioning a little bit more on this thread about how Romans conceptualized military command in this connection. The word for a military command in Latin is imperium. Imperium is cognate with our words imperial and empire, and in Latin, this word imperium can mean empire in the sense of the Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire, but the basic sense of the word is a specific power or command over something, almost in the sense of like a jurisdiction. And when a Roman military commander received their mandate and their troops to lead, this was a political process, a legal process, that was debated by the Senate and was passed into law, and the commander then had imperium bestowed upon them to carry out this particular mission to lead an army to a particular place. And this imperium was a legal designation. It could be withdrawn as well by a legal process. So reflecting this legal idea of a military command, Caesar, for instance, when he went to go conquer Gaul, he had an initial grant of imperium for a few years, and the job wasn't done after that first grant of imperium, so he had to get it renewed by the Senate, working through his allies in the Senate. And they helped him do that. He did get his imperium legally renewed, so then he got a second term of imperium to finish the job up in Gaul. Now, him crossing the boundary into Italy is on the one hand a move into domestic territory, but it also represented the place where his imperium, this legal concept of the bestowed imperium, ran out. If he crossed over that river, then he was violating law by taking his imperium, his command, into his own hands beyond the remit for which it was granted to him. He was taking the legally bestowed power for a particular place, a particular period of time, and sort of taking it and running with it against the law. So he was breaking the law in what he was doing as well. There's so much more to say about not just this story, but about a lot of the characters who figure into this, like Crassus and Pompey, who are mentioned. For Pompey, you can hear a bit more about his career in the Wine Dark Sea video on Roman Judea from December 2021, I think. It was sort of a Christmas special. And I really can't encourage you enough to check out some of the other great treatments of the Roman Civil War on YouTube and podcasts on Spotify and plenty of other great books out there. The late Roman Republic is a fascinating period of time, with a real overabundance of interesting characters and lots of intrigue. Game of Thrones has nothing on this period. And we know a lot about it thanks to the richness of our sources at this time, including Caesar himself, who wrote so many of his own experiences down. So, plenty more to come. Thank you for listening to this commentary video, and enjoy the rest of your day. If you have any more questions or comments to add, definitely share them with me on the platform. And multas gratias, as the Romans would say, for supporting the channel. Until next time, and remember to cast your die, I suppose, but hopefully not in a way that sparks a civil war.